I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by DEEPAK Chopra, a true pioneer in integrative medicine who's been called one of the top 100 heroes and icons of the century by Time magazine. Dr. Chopra is the author of over 85 books in over 43 languages, including many fiction and nonfiction New York Times bestsellers. Today, we're discussing the themes in his latest book, MetaHuman, Unleashing Your Infinite Potential, which is focused on venturing beyond daily living and experiencing heightened states of consciousness. So Deepak, welcome. And let me start by asking you about the inspiration for MetaHuman. You had told the Ashbury Park Press that the book was an exploration of what reality is prior to constructs and prior to conditioning. So what I wanted to ask was, is this touching upon kind of the hypothesis that we substitute symbols for actual perceptions in life?
Yes. The actual experience of existence is just awareness of existence. You know, we all have that feeling that I exist. It's a universal feeling. I don't think there's any living organism that doesn't have that basic experience of I exist or I am. So that's very universal. That little glimpse of I am is the window to reality. Because without I am, without you as existence, or shall we say awareness of existence, because existence and awareness of existence have to be synonymous. If you're not aware of existence, then for practical purposes, you don't exist. So awareness of existence is existence. And that surfaces as the feeling I am, without words. Now, everything else that we have a word for is a construct that requires the presence of I am. To know the universe, you need to exist. You need to be aware. To know your body, you need to be aware. To know your mind, you need to be aware. To know the world, to know this experience that we're having, you have to be aware. So awareness is fundamental to any experience, but it's also prior to any experience. The experience itself is very simple. It's either a sensation or a sense perception or an image or a feeling or a thought, and they're all entangled. So if I tell you to think of, say, your mother, immediately an image comes, and the image is obviously not in your brain because there's no picture in the brain. There's some neural correlate in the brain, which is also an experience, by the way. But an image comes. I think let's think of your mother. Okay, an image comes, then a feeling comes, emotion comes, and then perhaps some memories come. And then you experience a story, brothers, sisters, mother, father, etc., etc. In just that one thought is the entanglement of all experience as sensations, images, perceptions, thoughts. Just that one experience, they're all entangled. Those are symbolic representations of consciousness. Consciousness itself is the reservoir, or awareness is the reservoir or the knowing element in every experience. It is that in which these symbols arise, these perceptions arise. They arise on the screen of consciousness and then they subside. And they're very ephemeral, they're very transient. Every perception is a snapshot. So I look at you, I look there, that's another snapshot. I look at the Milky Way galaxy, that's another snapshot. And these snapshots strung together in awareness create a story which we call I'm DEEPAK Chopra or I'm Tim Ventura. But those are symbolic representations of I am.
Ah, okay. Now, so one of the things, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but so in MetaHuman, you've described this in detail. You go into the symbolism and the representation and the I am awareness. And you also offer 31-day guide to being able to practice techniques to help you see through the illusions that we all create for ourselves. So I'm wondering if you could describe some of that some of what you've kind of outlined in the book and what people can expect when they practice that?
So the 31 days in MetaHuman, the book at the end, are actually ways to deconstruct the stories that you've told yourself or that you've heard. We are basically products of stories. The first stories, when humans started telling stories, that was almost maybe 30, 40,000 years ago. There were 8 or 10 different types of humans. The human species is part of a larger family, just like primates are larger family, or tigers and lions and cheetahs and cats and leopards are the same family, lion family, but they're different species. So too, about 30,000 years ago, there were 8, 10 different types of humans. We are Homo sapiens. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, which means the wise ones. So we had enough hubris or humility, whatever, to give ourselves that name, but we gave names to other species: Homo habilis, Homo neanderthals, Floroensis, etc. And all of these humans had a rudimentary language, mostly about danger or mating or food, basically survival words, And then one species, Homo sapiens, created a language for telling stories. And that's what differentiated us from the other humans. The first stories apparently were gossip, and they're still the most common story. Who's sleeping with whom, who is cheating on whom, who can be trusted, who can't be trusted, etc. And then these stories evolved into what we call mythology. And that became cultural mythology, became religion. And then religion became philosophy, theology, and ultimately today science. But we forget that these are human stories for the human conditioned mind, and we operate our lives through these stories. So humans are basically the conditioned mind. The conditioning is religious, mythological, theological, religious, scientific, economic, all of that goes back thousands of years. That's what creates our conditioned mind through which we see the world. So everything you're experiencing right now is filtered through the conditioned mind. It's not real. It's a partial fragment of a total reality, and it is also species specific. What you see is not what a caterpillar sees, or an insect with 100 eyes sees, or a bat that navigates through echolocation experiences, or a snake that experiences infrared. Your experience, my experience, is a human experience limited to a narrow band of perceptual activity. In fact, your visual activity is restricted to less than 1% of the electromagnetic spectrum. Your acoustic access is less than 1% of the sound spectrum. So what we experience through our 5 senses is less than 1% of what's happening out there. And we call it everyday reality, and it is our everyday reality, but it's actually a dreamscape in a human consciousness that we all kind of have the same constructs for. We made up those constructs: latitude, longitude, Greenwich Mean Time, Wall Street, money, nation states, you name it. Everything that we have a word for is a human construct for a very fundamental experience, but we see reality to that. If we go beyond that, that's what we call MetaHuman. You have access to infinite possibilities, infinite creativity, a higher vision for possibilities. And actually, once you understand the mechanics through which we create our personal reality, then you're free to be independent of the collective dreamscape and also create your own personal reality. And ultimately, if enough people buy into that reality, it becomes everybody's reality. If enough people say Greenwich Mean Time is standard time for the globe, then it becomes. It could have been Botswana Mean Time.
Yeah.
The MetaHuman is waking up from that. One of the simple exercises is just close your eyes and you see total blackness. Close your eyes, you see total blackness. Now open your eyes, you see a three-dimensional world with color, shape, form, sounds, textures. You created that because the world actually is black. Electromagnetic radiation has no color, okay? It has no shape. It has no sound. And yet, all I have to do is open my eyes and listen, and suddenly this blackness of possibilities becomes this theater of space-time and causality with fictional characters like Tim Ventura, his wife, me, and all those others who are listening to us. We're all fictional characters in a collective dreamscape.
I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying. So it really it's helping to get through, and these symbols that you talk about, really, I mean, what we're doing is, you mentioned we only see 1% of the spectrum, and so we already have a limited view, and then we're boiling that down further into symbols. And so symbols, as I'd sent you in the questions, that's really, for me, that was one of the things that intrigued me about MetaHuman as I was reading through it. And so I wanted to ask about some of the current issues, I guess, that we're facing, because race, political affiliation, and social class, those are all symbols. And America is currently struggling with social turmoil based on essentially all of us reducing other people to symbols and labels. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on, if we're able to see past those symbols, if we're able to see past those labels, do you think that that might help us solve some of the civil unrest that we're currently struggling with?
Yes, the only cure for all forms of human suffering, is to understand that the symbol is not the reality. Even our body is a symbol. It's a changing symbol of experience, right? You were a fertilized ovum, then you were a zygote, then you were an embryo, then you were a baby, then you were a toddler, then you were a child, then you were a teenager, then you were a young adult, then you become an old person, finally you die. So this is a symbolic representation of consciousness having an experience as Homo sapiens or this particular biological organism. But it's still symbolic. This is symbolic representation. But when we mistake the symbol for the reality, then we create all kinds of constructs like birth and death. Death happens to a symbol, not to you. Okay? Birth happens to a symbol, not to you, because your consciousness, which is spaceless, timeless, borderless, irreducible, fundamental, without cause, everything else is symbolic representation. Like racial identity, for example. If I go beneath the surface of the skin, all of us, every human being comes from Africa. So genetically, we're all Africans. Then we migrated to different parts of the world, and the climate influenced the way we look, the way we speak, the food we eat, and the culture we create. But now those symbols have become reality. So we say, these are African Americans, these are Europeans, this is the white race, and this is Filipino, and all of that. It's all symbols. Beneath the skin, genetically, we're all exactly the same, all African. Okay, now, but because of this symbology, we've created, nation states, we've created ethnocentrism, we've created extreme nationalism, we've created trade wars, we've created colonial empires, we created slavery, we created social injustice, we created economic injustice, we created eco-destruction because we think we're different from the microorganisms. In fact, 99, not 99, but over 90% of the genetic information in your body is microbial. It's the planetary microbiome, and it's not even human. So who are we? When you look at this deeply, you'll realize that what I call me is entangled with everything else. So a deeper understanding of reality would help us ultimately go through personal and social transformation so we could actually achieve or hope to achieve a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. Because right now, all the wars, all the arguments, all the political strife, all the religious strife is only about symbols. It's not about reality.
Yeah, and you know, that takes me actually right into the next question, because those same symbols, and this is something that you've said, are creating the impression for us that happiness and fulfillment and joy are something that's outside of us, right? And so we're, I mean, I guess in the most simplistic form, you know, when we talk about consumer culture, people feel that they need to achieve this status symbol or have this much money in the bank. But really what you've said is those are just representations of things, and that those states of happiness and joy and fulfillment are within ourselves, right?
Yeah, so, you know, a very simple way of saying this is that we mistake our selfie for ourself. So what you're looking at right now as a body is a selfie. Yeah? It's a snapshot. The self is something much deeper. And the selfie is also changing all the time, right? It's if I took a selfie of you right now, you took one of yourself and you compared it with 10 years ago, or one in the future, they all look different, right? So the selfie is changing, yet all our self-esteem comes from the selfie, not from the self. So when you mistake the symbol for the reality, then what happens is you start asking yourself, am I superior? Am I inferior? You need validation, you need approval, you need to control, you engage in power mongering, cronyism, corruption, all kinds of things just to improve self-image, forgetting that self-image is not self-esteem. Self-esteem comes from knowing your true self, which is immune to criticism, which is independent of the good and bad opinions of others, which is fearless, which is the source of all of our creativity, is the self. Everything is the self. But mistaking the self-image for the self causes all our suffering. In fact, the Eastern wisdom traditions say the causes of human suffering are only 5. Number 1, not knowing the true nature of reality, which is mistaking symbols for reality. Number 2, grasping at experience and clinging to it, but all experience is transient, it's ephemeral, it's evanescent, it's ungraspable. If I asked you to hold on to this experience we're having right now, we can't. It's moving. So grasping and clinging to experience, which is ungraspable, recoiling from experience, which is also ungraspable, identifying with your ego, which is a fiction, and the fear of death, which is a construct based on all these wrong representations of reality. So once we understand how to unravel that, we actually go from pain to bliss, from suffering to joy.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about that, my wife Fawn was telling me last night, she'd been reading about your time as a monk, and that was exciting because she's from Thailand, and so she practices.
My dad.
Yeah.
Because my dad was ordained as a monk too, and my grandfather was a monk too. So
yeah, so I went all the way to Thailand to experience that, and it was a wonderful experience in a forest monastery, living like a monk, shaving my head, going with a begging bowl every day to get some food, and noticing the generosity of spirit of all the people who basically gave you food so they could get some good karma.
And you know, I read your book. In fact, she gave me your book on Buddha.
I see. Okay, very good.
And it was inspiring. It was truly inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Well, the interesting thing about that though was, so again, in terms of symbols, all of the world's major religions use symbols all the time, right? That's a major part of all of the religions and many philosophies, you know, it just throughout. And the thing that intrigued me though was in all of these religious traditions, spiritual leaders have had moments of transcendence where they see beyond. And in a strange way, even though it's about symbols, it's these moments of seeing beyond that define the future symbols. And so I'm wondering, it seems almost like there's maybe a universal truth that these figures have tapped into And then maybe what we see as religions is just the way that they're attempting to interpret that, or something along those lines. Is that?
Yes, if you look at the experiences of all the great founders of religion, but also, all from Moses to Jesus to Muhammad to the Buddha, you find three things that are common. Okay. One is transcendence. So the experience goes beyond space-time and causality. You transcend the world of opposites, pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, up and down. The world of contrast, the world of duality is transcended into this experience where you feel connected with all there is. That's one. Two is, as a result of that, there's the emergence of what are called Platonic values, named after Plato: truth, goodness, beauty, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity. So the second aspect after transcendence of the so-called religious or spiritual experience is Platonic values: truth, goodness, harmony, love, compassion, joy, equanimity. And the third component is loss of the fear of death, because the transcendent part of you is not in space-time. So those are the three common features of all religious experience. They're very difficult to translate into language, even though we're trying right now. So what people do is they like the description. They want to have the description. They haven't had the description. So they haven't had the experience. They like the description. So they become religious followers. Like Jesus is saying, I'm pointing my finger there, and people are worshipping the finger instead of looking at what he's pointing at.
Yeah.
You know, and Jesus is saying, all things that I do, you can do as well. The Father is in me, the Lord is in me, is in you. Lord being his description of the divine or ungraspable, infinite, unimaginable, formless intelligence at the background of all this experience. But, you know, we express it in symbols. So what happens is religious followers become worshippers of symbols instead of having the experience themselves. If I listen to Jesus Christ and the Sermon on the Mount, I want to know what is giving him that experience that he can speak like that. Okay, and I want to have that experience instead of just listening to the lecture. You know, anybody can give a good lecture, but what is the experience behind that? And you see in the vision of these great luminaries, Jesus Christ, Jalaluddin Rumi, Adi Shankara, Moses, Muhammad, Buddha, Mahavir Jain, Eastern philosophers, Zen, these same things, they actually knew the difference between symbols, which are the contents of awareness, and awareness, which is non-symbolic. So we can say the religious experience is knowing your non-symbolic self. That's it.
And you know, this also dovetails into, I guess, what you might call psychic or paranormal experiences, you know? And because again, those, in some ways, those are transcendent, but they and maybe in the same way, they almost defy symbolism. And so when people talk about moments of like precognition and clairvoyance and many of these other things that we call paranormal experiences, I think to a greater or lesser degree, all of us have experienced some of those or hints of them at one time or another. But you know, in our society, it's very difficult to qualify or quantify those. And do you think that that might be why? Because they defy symbolism? We're just not able to put them into it?
I think, Tim, the bigger issue here, before we go into the paranormal, is to understand the normal. Nobody understands the normal. Right now, all that's coming to your eyes right now are photons from your computer. No color, no shape, no form. All that's happening in your retina is an electrochemical activity. Okay? That has no color as well. Okay? No sound. What's going from your retina to your brain through your optic nerve is an electrical current. It's called an action potential.
Yeah.
It doesn't have any sound, color, or form. What's happening in your brain is electrochemistry. No sound, no color, no form. But what you're experiencing is this. You're experiencing me, your computer, your wife, your thoughts, the room behind you. How's that happening? We can't explain it. It's called the heart problem of consciousness. How do electrochemicals and the movement, a random movement of atoms, create a universe that's so precise for mind and life, for consciousness, for our own questioning of reality? How do random movements of atoms create insight, intuition, imagination, thought, perception? That's called the heart problem of consciousness. And it's called the heart problem of consciousness because we are actually assuming that the world is physical. Okay, that's an assumption. But actually what we're experiencing is not a physical world. We are experiencing perceptions. And we don't know how any force field or atoms or molecules can create perception, because force fields and atoms and molecules are our own constructs too, based on experience. Even the brain is a human construct. How do you know you have a brain? You experience it, you see it on a CAT scan, on a dissection table, on a virtual reality apparatus or whatever. But in order to call something a brain, you have to first know that it exists. You have to first have the experience. You have to first have the perception. That's in consciousness. So we cannot explain the normal. Forget the, people say, I have out-of-body experiences. Well, explain to me, how do you have an in-body experience? Because there's no one inside you, okay? There is no one inside your body. Your body is an experience in you. Your mind is an experience in you. The world is an experience in you. Once you understand that even the normal is totally inexplicable, then the paranormal is just an extension of that. Our body mind has leaky margins, very leaky margins. This is a semi-permeable membrane. Anything outside this semi-permeable membrane that I call my skin, I call the world. Anything inside, I say that's me. But actually, this is an artificial boundary. The world outside is as much me as the world inside me. The air is my breath. I wouldn't be alive if there wasn't an atmosphere. The stars made the atoms that are recycling as my body. The rivers and the oceans are my circulation. The earth is recycling as my physical body. So where is the margin between me and the world? There is no margin. You put an animal, a mammal, like a rabbit in a vacuum, it dies. You put a plant in the same vacuum, it dies too. You put them both together, they live because they're entangled. There's no outer, there's no inner. They're the same differentiated, same differentiated consciousness expressing themselves as different sentient beings. A plant, a tree, a squirrel, a bat, a human, a crocodile, a snake. They're all species of consciousness differentiated from one consciousness. Just like a stem cell differentiates into eyes, nose, heart, liver, kidney. They're not separate, they're differentiated. So too, we are not separate, we are differentiated. Once we get rid of this leaky margins, we have access to the future, to the past, because all these are actually modes of knowing and perception. So whether it's the clairvoyance or clairaudience or psychic powers or remote healing or remote viewing or remembrance of other lifetimes, these two are cognitive and perceptual experience of subtle form in our consciousness as much as this. What I'm seeing right now, I call it the physical world, but it's not physical. It's my dreamscape that I have carved out of less than 1% of reality. Even my physical body. If I could see your physical body as it really is, 99.99999% of it is empty space, because those atoms that make your body are also empty space. So 99.9999% of your body is empty space. You're traveling at 250 kilometers per second around the galaxy right now because the Earth is spinning and moving circling the sun, and the galaxies are expanding, the space between galaxies expanding. Nothing that you see is real. The earth appears flat. We know it's not. The ground appears stationary. We know it's spinning at dizzying speeds and hurtling through space at thousands of miles an hour. Things appear solid and have color and shape. That's a totally process in consciousness. Actually, this is as much electromagnetic activity as anything else. It has no color, no shape. So paranormal, normal are all part of a spectrum of the inexplicable consciousness that conceives, constructs, governs, and becomes what we call the experience of the physical body and the world. So I would get rid of these words: paranormal, non-local, psychic. This is part of the spectrum of experience in human consciousness.
Yeah, and that's an amazing description. And it's also, when you were talking about science, that one of the things that I've always kind of wondered about, and you've mentioned a lot of scientific concepts and terms, is I guess in the Western tradition, one of the things that we really focus on, right, is scientifically measuring the relationship between things, right? That's kind of the basis of science and mathematics. And when I thought about MetaHuman, as I was reading through, I thought, we're really missing something, because we're not really stepping below that to say, what is this? We're just focused on relationships. And so science, I think, has given us a lot, but then it seems like there's another level. Like you mentioned, we're only seeing a small percent of what's there.
And we call it reality. Now, once science expands and says the subject-object split is artificial, but it's necessary for us to do science, but we can't ignore consciousness, then science will be more complete. Right now, science, I think, is fragmented. It doesn't give us access to reality. It gives us access to a virtual reality. But that's good enough. Without that, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right? If I had not designated New York at such latitude, such longitude, then the pilot couldn't fly to New York, right? From San Francisco or whatever. So the symbols actually help us navigate our everyday experience of reality, as long as we don't forget that the symbols are not the reality. Because once we mistake the symbols for reality, we limit ourselves and our creativity.
So would it be fair to say that this I guess you might almost call it like a detached inner critic? Is that when people read MetaHuman, is that something they should be striving to develop? Is maybe being able to step outside of their experience and keep in mind that what
actually detached inner experience also means non-conceptual awareness of what is. So, since your wife read the Buddha and you are reading the book too, people ask, why did the Buddha sit under a tree and get enlightened? What was it all about? And there's a very famous lecture of the Buddha that is referred to as the silent sermon. So what he does is he comes out of his cave, holds a flower in his hand, and everybody's looking at the flower, including his favorite disciple Ananda. And after about a few minutes, Ananda smiles and the Buddha smiles back, and the sermon is over. Everybody says, what happened? I mean, the Buddha didn't say a word. All he did was hold a flower. And so they go to Ananda, the favorite disciple. They said, hey, all we saw is the flower, but it looks like the two of you saw something else. And so Ananda says, yeah, I saw the flower, but I also saw rainbows and sunshine and earth and water. I saw the wind. I saw the infinite void. I saw stars and galaxies. I saw the whole universe stopping for a moment and pretending to be a flower. Now, that is an amazing insight that comes from witnessing awareness, which is when you look at something long enough without labeling it with your constructs, it reveals itself as the entire universe. So if I ask you, what is this? You'd say it's a piece of paper, but it's also a tree. It's also an ecosystem. It's also the flora and fauna of that ecosystem. It's the birds, the bees, the weather patterns, the atmosphere, climate change. All of this, the whole history of the universe is right in this piece of paper. And that's what the Buddha saw. Without judgment, without labels, just silent witnessing.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, and this is probably more challenging one, but right now, all of us are going through a lot of fear and uncertainty about the coronavirus pandemic. And I just felt like that was something that I absolutely had to ask you about, partly so that you could help us understand. I mean, there is a real health concern. There's also a very large symbolic threat. And I think that it took so many people by surprise that we're all still struggling to process it, understand what's really going on. So I was hoping to ask, I mean, first, how are you doing? How are you doing in the pandemic? And
I'm taking a lot of time to reinvent my body and resurrect my soul and celebrate awareness of existence, but also to ask ourselves collectively, what is the meaning of this? You know, we are presently, what we're going through is a grieving process because we lost a way of life that seems no longer available to us. So there's grief. Anytime you lose something, there's grief. And when people go through grief, they go through certain stages. First, there's victimization. Why me? Well, in this case, it's the whole world. It's not just you and me. And we are actually better off than most people. The second stage is resentment, grievance, anger. The third stage is frustration. The fourth stage is resignation and helplessness. I've seen that happen in 1 hour in a patient who's dying of a heart attack, all these stages of grief. But then in some people, there's another stage. It's called acceptance. And once they come to that stage, they feel peace. And from there emerges meaning. So I'm asking myself, what is the meaning of all this? And, you know, as I look out of my window, I see that the air is clearer, the stars are brighter. I hear that people are breathing in Bangalore for the first time. Asthmatics can breathe. I hear that fish are returning to dead lakes. Even the canals of Venice are seeing fish for the first time. I hear that the birds are singing in the morning in polluted cities. I see that the bees are coming back. Bees are responsible for 90% of the nutrition on this planet. We thought they were going to disappear. They were becoming extinct, which would mean that extinction for all of us. They're back. Okay, so something is happening. Nature is repairing herself. And then when you look at these mutations, you know, you say, how long has Corona been around? Well, 55 million years. How long have humans been around? 200,000 years. What are viruses? They are communication systems of the ecosystem of the entangled microbial information in the body. 90% of the genetic information in your body is bacterial, fungal, and viral. You wouldn't be able to survive with them. What's a mutation? A mutation is an error, a genetic mistake. Now, scientists today say that most mutations are random. Maybe they are. But it's also clear that when there's toxicity in the environment, that mutations occur. We know that from cancer, for example. Cancer mutations can occur as a result of environmental toxicity in the food, you know, chemicals in the food, inflammatory products, hormones, antibiotics. In fact, all inflammatory products, all manufactured food has inflammatory products, petroleum products. You're putting that in your body. You're putting that in the atmosphere. You're putting that in the earth. There's climate change. All of this is connected. The mutations are a stressed ecosystem. We will have a vaccine soon, hopefully, but it'll be temporary, you know, because mutations will come and go. And I think the meaning right now is how do we repair our damaged ecosystem, and the basis of that is the entanglement of genetic information on our planet in the soil. 1 teaspoon of soil under the surface of the rainforest in the Amazon, 1 teaspoon of soil has more genetic biodiversity than all the rainforests of the planet combined. That's our resource right there, underneath the ground. Genetic information, which is responsible for all life on this planet. Right now, that ecosystem is totally stressed. Climate change, extinction of species, poison in the food chain. And if we don't understand that, mutations will come and go, pandemics will come and go. But if we do understand that, then we have a holistic approach to avoid these devastating mutations in the future. Remains to be seen.